How do you turn a lifetime of surfing into a memoir? William Finnegan will join us to talk about his new book, Barbarian Days.
It's all about this experience of beauty, this certain kind of drenched experience in beauty. And the physical risks are very much footnotes.
How did the field of meteorology evolve? Peter Moore will tell us about the weather experiment, the pioneers who sought to see the future.
So you had aeromancy, which was divining the future using things like cloud formations and wind currents, and this was considered as one of the 7 forbidden arts of Renaissance magic.
Alexandra Alter will tell us what's going on in the publishing world. Greg Cowles has bestseller news. We'll also let readers and listeners ask a few questions for us editors here at The Times. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. William Finnegan joins us now. He is a staff writer at The New Yorker and the author of a new book, Barbarian Days, A Surfing Life, reviewed this week in the Book Review. Hi there.
Hi.
So this is, in certain ways, an expansion of an article you wrote in The New Yorker about 25 years ago called Playing Doc's Games.
Yes.
Tell us about that original story.
Well, I was living in San Francisco. Surfing at Ocean Beach is kind of a crazy, cold, scary spot off San Francisco with this physician, Mark Renneker is his name, who was a really sort of charismatic, big wave surfer. So I had a notion to write a piece about him and proposed it to The New Yorker. I was freelancing in those days and got the assignment. But the piece took me 7 years to write. I'd never written about surfing before, although I'd done it all my life. I'd never really thought how to try to communicate about surfing to non-surfing readers. I had other inhibitions and struggles with that piece, but I finally got it done, and it was published in 1992. I got a strangely big reaction.
Why strange?
I don't know. I was writing about all these serious topics. I was turning out books and articles on apartheid in those days and civil wars and serious topics. And then I did this relatively light piece about surfing, and that was the one people got really excited about.
They didn't care about the drug cartels in Mexico or South Africa nearly as much.
Not in the same way. And in fact, that piece had a strangely long afterlife. I still, to this day, people hear I surf and they bring up that piece and start talking about it to me. I've even had people in the water. I don't know at all. This happened recently in Mexico. A guy started talking to me about that piece in the water in Mexico. And of course, when I say, "Oh, I wrote that," nobody believes me. It partly cued me that there was maybe something more to be done there, and that I could perhaps write about. I've had this very intense 50-year surfing life now, and that I could perhaps write about my life through the lens of surfing.
What's the challenge in writing about surfing?
Well, there are various. Just to keep, say, non-surfing readers turning the pages is a challenge. You've got to get them out in the water. This is for the actual surfing passages, which is probably a minority of the pages. In fact, I know it is a minority of the pages in this book. But for the surfing sections, you've got to really get people out in the water, keep them oriented, which is kind of a trick, and then really give them a stake in the outcome. From what I've heard, that's worked for a lot of non-surfers, feel like they've been out in the water for the first time. As
a writer, when you were approaching this book, did you think of it as I'm writing a memoir, or did you think of it as I'm writing a book about surfing?
Memoir. I wasn't interested in, writing the history of surfing or about professional surfing or surf stars or any of that sort of stuff. That comes in tangentially here and there. But I really wanted to try to get at the thing itself, my own experience of it as a kind of hardcore surfer, hardcore kid. I was kind of a feral traveler for a number of years, just really obsessed with finding waves. And then I've tried to continue, and I still surf as much as I can. I surfed yesterday. I try to integrate it into my life as an adult, which is a trick.
Where do you surf now?
Well, yesterday on Long Island. If the wind had been more west, it would have been New Jersey, and it depends on the conditions.
You grew up in California and Hawaii, two big surfing enclaves. How did you get introduced to surfing? Did your father surf?
No, my father didn't surf, but he was a mad sailor, and we just spent a lot of time at the beach of Southern California. And a friend and his family surfed, and I spent summers with them. And it was in Newport Beach, California. And I just Well, you start with body surfing. I mean, the main thing with surfing to learn is to get really comfortable in the ocean, to know the ocean. So I sort of spent my childhood in the ocean. In fact, really, reading waves is reading them well, reading them correctly is the most important thing, much more than writing them. If you haven't got the reading down, the writing will never happen.
Was it an immediate passion for you?
Yes. I loved being in the water and being in waves. And then the first time I stood up on a surfboard was kind of a revelation. Yeah. I got more obsessed when we moved to Hawaii, and then it really became a kind of – I was raised Catholic, and after my confirmation when I was 13, my parents gave me the choice to not go to Mass, much to my shock. And I stopped and kind of left the church, and surfing really filled a gap there for me.
What year was this?
1966 or 67, 66.
And so for those not in the surfing world, is there a kind of golden age of surfing, or is that specific to different areas? And what was it like in Hawaii in the 60s as a surfer?
Well, for me, it was absolutely wonderful. The waves were better, bigger, the surfers were better.
How could the waves be better? Because a non-surfer thinks like waves are waves. I mean, how do they go from being better to worse?
You could rate waves sort of 1 to 100, and you could argue whether that's a 56 or a 55. I mean, they're crummy waves, small onshore winds, not much fun to ride. And then there are great waves that are, absolutely ecstatic experiences. They're bigger, they're hollower, they're more powerful, they're more regularly peeling. One could go on and on about.
Oh, but when you said the waves were better, did you mean the waves were better then, or the waves were better there?
Oh, I'm sorry. The waves were better there.
Oh, okay. So I thought like the waves in Hawaii were no longer as good as they were in that golden era. Okay.
No. You asked about a golden era. It's a good question because there's a lot of nostalgia that comes with surfing, even with little kids. I mean, when I was a little kid, we were all very nostalgic for an era we'd missed, when it was less crowded, when there was nobody at Malibu, and big days at Rincon were 3 guys out, and everybody does that to this day. And so when I write about surfing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, a lot of surfers read this stuff and say, "Oh my God, you were there for the dawn of discovery. You were there for the golden age." But I'm not the least bit nostalgic about it, and people are surprised when they read that because I kept voluminous journals from those days. Those are kind of a reality check on the nostalgia. It was crowded even then at the more famous places, and I was very, very lucky to surf some of the great waves in the world early in there. I mean, before they were discovered or before they were well known, and I celebrate those pretty lyrically in here. But in general, if there was a golden age, it was long before my time.
Well, it's like backpacking. You were never there when. You're always there after.
Yes.
What was the culture in Hawaii of surfing? How was it different from California, where you'd been before?
It was distinctly different. My best friends there when I was a kid were some Hawaiian brothers, the Kalakakuis, whose dads surfed, and it was clearly a quite deep tradition in their family and in their world. And it wasn't at all oppositional. I think surfing's got a lot less kind of association with juvenile delinquency now. Lots of yuppies and professionals of different kinds surf now. Some people say it's yoga or golf. It's
become corporatized.
Yeah, but when I was a kid, certainly in Southern California, I think on the East Coast too. I mean, the authorities were not happy to see you surfing. I mean, there were beach towns that banned surfing. You'd never have had a surfing team in the high school. I mean, it was for little bad kids, cool kids. But it wasn't that in Hawaii at all. It was much more deeply woven into the fact. I mean, it's the birthplace of surfing. It's where surfing started, Hawaii, and it still had that feeling in the place. And I'd never been around that before. It was one of the many joys of moving. And the water's warmer, and the waves were bigger, and I learned a lot. My surfing sort of jumped ahead by living in Hawaii when I was young.
You then traveled for many years. Was that driven by surfing? Was it driven by work? Was it just personal?
It was mostly driven by surfing. I mean, I had finished graduate school and had saved a little money. I was working on the railroad in California, and it almost felt mandatory. It's almost like I didn't think I had an option as, I've saved some money. Now is the time to go on the huge surf trip. And I was gone nearly 4 years, most of it in the Southern Hemisphere, just looking for waves. But I had a lot of jobs, different jobs on that, keep me going. My savings soon ran out. looking back on it, I mean, it was a pivotal year I spent in South Africa teaching in a black high school near Cape Town. I later wrote a book about that.
What year was that?
That was 1980. It was a really intense year. The kids went out on strike for a few months, protesting apartheid in education. It got very violent. A lot of people were hurt and killed in the community where I worked. And I actually came out of that experience. I was writing fiction up till then. I was, at the time, working on a novel. And I came out of that experience just only interested in political journalism and started writing for a living after that and doing, nonfiction and sort of taught myself to be a journalist and freelancing then and I've basically been a political journalist ever since.
And was your surfing life, did you consider that a hobby, or did you ever think of it as something you wanted to write about, or was that purely separate from your...
It was purely separate. I couldn't imagine writing about it. I almost felt like I had nothing to say about it, that it was a private thing, that it was something I just had always done and there was nothing to say. But then came that assignment to write about the fellow in San Francisco. And
so that wasn't your idea?
It was my idea, but what happened was I was freelancing at the time, and I sent to the New Yorker a little column, political thing over the transom. It was about Nicaragua, where I'd just gone on assignment for another magazine, and they took it. Somebody in the editor's office, William Shawn was the editor then, said, it'd be a good time to propose a big piece, to get an assignment here. I thought, okay, and I felt like I had to do it that afternoon. I didn't have any other ideas, and here I was surfing with this guy who was like a John McPhee hero, this big, charismatic, sort of outdoor Superman. And so I just proposed this John McPhee piece, and they said, sure, fine. And I'm not John McPhee. I couldn't write that. So it took me years to figure out what to write. And that's when I first started thinking about writing about surfing. But and I actually had an ongoing dialogue with that guy who was the most obsessive, devoted surfer I've ever known. He was absolutely, and he still is to this day.
Earlier you referred to him as a big wave surfer.
Yeah.
What's a big wave surfer as opposed to just a surfer?
There's a very small percentage of surfers who chase really, really big waves, and they seem to me to be kind of built of different stuff. They don't seem to have the basic fight or flight instinct that the rest of us have. I write a lot about surfing bigger waves in this book, but I'm not a big wave surfer. I have normal amounts of fear, I think.
What constitutes a big wave as opposed to just one that probably looks big to people who aren't surfing it?
Yeah, it's all relative, of course, and all surfers have a kind of upper limit, the waves, what they're willing to surf, and it's big to them. And what's big to me, to a big wave surfer, is laughable.
What's big to you?
What's big to me is a wave that I think can drown me. It's usually 2, 3, 4 times overhead as you stand up, and it breaks really hard, often in shallow water. Deeper water, safer. It's strange. I've kind of got more interested in bigger waves in middle age, and it's a little bit of a compensation. My sort of small wave skills are deteriorating with age. I can feel it, and that gets blurred in bigger waves. It's a different thing, and I can still do it. And I also seem to panic a little less than I used to in big waves. And you see really incredible, just beautiful, beautiful things out in the water when it's big that you can't see from shore.
Surfing seems like one of those sports where, you used the word sort of chasing earlier when you were talking about traveling, where like mountain climbing or scuba diving, it's as much about the location and the biggest, the deepest. Do you see it that way? Do they seem to fit a similar category?
Well, it certainly is about location, about place. Not necessarily the superlatives, the biggest, the deepest. Most surfers, if you just glance and see surfers down at the end of the street out in the water, they're all engaged in the same sort of basic occupation, which is trying to read the waves, trying to understand what they're doing and what they're going to do. And it's incredibly complex. Different breaks are different, but it changes all the time, with the tide, with the wind, with the swell, with the angle of the swell, size of the swell, and down to, every eddy, like individual rocks. Guys are trying to understand, usually their local spot. It's this profound absorption in the immediacies of that place. And I've sort of devoted myself to a number of places over the years, and that's a lot of what I write about. So in that sense, yeah, it's like as with rock climbing or something, it's, that rock is very, very important. Don't underestimate it. Don't misjudge it.
It sounds like an art and a science. Is the whole idea of surfers as kind of being these laid back, dude, sort of stoner guys, a misconception, or
No, there are many such guys all over the world now. But it's also true that every surfer is an oceanographer of a quite dedicated, applied kind, and you can, in usually the slang of surfing, have a very detailed conversation about especially their local spots. And these are longitudinal studies over long periods of time. Guys that devote years to understanding what a wave does at a certain place, or what waves can do at that place, so that they can be in the right spot and ride them well.
Everyone has their own level of comfort with risk, and what seems like a risk-taking sport, bungee jumping or ski jumping, to someone doesn't seem risky to the person involved. Do you think of surfing as a very risky sport? Is it dangerous to you?
That's not how I think about it, no. I mean, there are plenty of ways to get hurt, hit by your board or somebody else's board, or hit the bottom, or get held down. But it's much more, my surfing, I can really mainly speak for my surfing, it's all about this experience of beauty, this really sort of certain kind of drenched experience in beauty. And the physical risks are very much footnotes.
Well, I'm still scared, but not of reading about it. The book again is Barbarian Days, A Surfing Life by William Finnegan. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for having me.
Alexandra Alter is here to talk about the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
So there was some book that came out this week that sold well?
Yeah, a little author named Harper Lee released her second novel ever. And there has been quite a bit of discussion about the contents of the book, the origins of the book, why she suddenly changed her mind and decided to publish a book after so many decades.
But you're going to give us the cold, hard numbers.
I'm giving you the cold, hard numbers because whatever A Go Set a Watchman means for Harper Lee's legacy, it's been a huge boon for booksellers and will continue to be. The novel apparently set one-day sales records for adult fiction at Barnes & Noble and Books A Million. I take that distinction of adult fiction to mean that it did not outsell the first day sales for Harry Potter. But Barnes & Noble has said that they expect Watchmen to be their biggest selling title of the year. And on Amazon, it's in the top selling spot. To Kill a Mockingbird has also gotten a huge boost. That's close behind. HarperCollins didn't make first day sales figures available according to Publishers Weekly, but in the UK it even sold more than 100,000 copies.
One of the interesting things I thought was the story that Kim Severson did back down in Monroeville, reporting from the scene, that it wasn't as big a crowd as the media anticipated. And I wonder what you made of that.
That's fascinating. I know. I thought that was a great piece. And there was another funny post, a dispatch that a journalist who went to Barnes & Noble, which opened early at 7 a.m., expecting these big crowds of customers, and they said that reporters outnumbered customers at Barnes & Noble in Union Square.
In Union Square.
Here.
I mean, I wonder if it's as much about the transformation of book selling as it is about anything else, because Monroeville has just one, it's a tiny town, right? And it has just one little bookstore / gift store.
That's right. It's got one bookstore. It's got, the residents, I think the population is somewhere around 6,300. But this little bookstore attracted people from all over the state and all over the region. So they had, I think, sold more than 8,000 copies, including pre-orders.
That's not bad.
So not bad
for
a little bookstore. But other independents across the country that I talked to said they were seeing increased foot traffic. Many had already sold through their initial orders and had requested more copies from HarperCollins. And they were sort of trying to turn this into a Harry Potter-style event with discussion groups and midnight openings and marathon readings and screenings of the movie.
Is it still number one on Amazon?
It's still number one on Amazon. But a few booksellers were a little wary about hyping the book too much, given the ongoing questions about exactly how and when it was rediscovered by Harper Lee's lawyer and some other unanswered questions. One independent store in Michigan, Brilliant Books, was actually offering customers who bought the book refunds and apologies, and they published a sort of scathing explanation on their website.
Was that because of the publishing story or because of the story told in the book itself?
It was not because of the content of the book itself. I'll read you a little bit of what they wrote on their website. They said, "We at Brilliant Books want to be sure that our customers are aware that Go Set a Watchman is not a sequel or a prequel to Kill a Mockingbird. Neither is it a new book. It's a first draft that was originally and rightfully rejected. The book and some of the characters therein are very much a product of this era in the South. We suggest you view this work as an academic insight rather than a nice summer novel.
That's very sharply worded.
Very sharply worded. And it goes on. It is disappointing and frankly shameful to see our noble industry parade and celebrate this as Harper Lee's new novel. This is pure exploitation of both literary fans and a beloved American classic.
There are precedents, obviously, for books being sort of found in the attic long after authors are dead and their intentions are not always clear.
For this kind of book to come out, it's more typical that it would come out posthumously. What's so unusual about this is that the author is alive but is, very publicity shy, so no one's been able to interview her. So I think that has allowed a lot of the uncertainty to build. But there's certainly precedents for, earlier versions, earlier works coming out, after an author has died. But I thought, for the most part, bookstores seem to be really celebrating this. This was one store really going out on a limb and even offering a refund, which I thought was interesting.
It's interesting because in the rest of the publishing world, July has been kind of quiet. I wonder if publishers sort of, saw this coming and thought, well, maybe we shouldn't compete with that juggernaut.
Clear the calendar for July. I think that's right. I think when the book was announced in February, everyone thought, oh, let's leave that week for Harper Lee.
Well, you've already gotten your Harper Lee reading done, so you can move on to August. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Peter Moore joins us now from London. He is the author of The Weather Experiment, The Pioneers Who Sought to See the Future. Hi, Peter.
Hello, Pamela.
So this is a book about meteorology and how it evolved.
That's correct. Yeah, I've basically looked at a specific period of history, 70 years in the 19th century, which I've identified as a really important time in the development of the science.
What made it important? How did it start?
I mean, I was surprised looking back at the year 1800 at just how little people knew in terms of, what they understood about the atmosphere in a scientific sense. They just didn't know, for example, how clouds floated in the air when water was denser than air, how high the atmosphere actually went upwards, how storms formed, how big storms were, how long did they travel for, why the sky was blue. There were all these really fundamental things that we take for granted today that they didn't understand. And I knew that just 70 years later, we'd got to a point whereby we were issuing the first weather forecasts. So we'd gone from a place where we didn't really understand things to a point where we'd gone beyond just understanding and we'd moved into prediction as well. So I thought that was a good story of progress that I wanted to tell.
How did we get into the idea of predicting, and what did people think of weather predictions before there was a scientific basis for it?
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, this was, to me, probably one of the most interesting parts of the story, which is this philosophical edge that weather's always had. And it's always been bound up with religion very closely. So, I mean, if you look back into, the Middle Ages, for example, so you had aeromancy, which was divining the future using things like cloud formations and wind currents, and this was considered as one of the 7 forbidden arts of Renaissance magic, along with things like necromancy. So this is 500 years ago. Then, even in the 17th century, when you get the start of the scientific revolution, and you have people like Newton and Harvey explaining things logically and rationally for the first time, you still have weather being a very much a divine force, like mood music, I always say. So, for example, I was reading a book about John Aubrey the other day, a really good new book by Ruth Skur, and she'd pointed out that there was one of Aubrey's friends called Dr. D, who in the 17th century, he diligently observed the weather for 7 years, and as a result had developed such skill that he'd been able to predict the weather that was going to come in the future, and for that he was accounted a witch by everyone. I mean, it was really bound up with this idea of the supernatural, and it was an area that science couldn't really stray into. I mean, even in the 19th century, a lot of this lingered on. So you'd have, for example, when there was a storm, the French astronomer Arago left a an account of how they used to go and ring the church bells to ward off the evil spirits in the storm. And this is only 150 years ago. So this is what they had to fight against, really, the scientists.
What role did storms play in terms of the evolution of meteorology? I mean, one would think that because they're big and because they often follow a kind of predictable path, that would be a way that meteorology might have kind of gotten started.
This idea of a predictable path seems very logical to us, but to them, when they lived in an age before the telegraph, for example, people had no spatial awareness beyond what they could see and from what they found out in letters and things. So there's really no idea of the path of storms and where they went, really, and where they came from until you had Benjamin Franklin, as ever, in the 18th century. But then storms, of course, were really important because they can be really catalytic moments, just because of the brutality of them. And in the 1850s, in Britain, we'd got to a point where people were understanding these things much better. They were understanding how a storm functioned, for example, how the wind spiraled around a central point of low pressure. And there was a very famous storm in which a boat called the Royal Charter was wrecked off the Welsh coast. That was a particularly dramatic moment because it was a gold ship. It was returning from Australia, carrying a lot of people who'd made their fortunes over the previous 10 years or so. The scientists in London knew the storm was coming because they were having telegraphed warnings of the storm, kind of relayed about, but they had no system and no framework to pass the knowledge on to the captain of this ship, which subsequently sunk with the loss of about 400 lives. All the women and children on it died as well. So it was seen as a particularly bad moment. And I think in a way it's a bit like a Titanic story before the Titanic, just because it was a very luxurious liner and it was a symbol of progress and modernity and a Victorian engineering prowess. These kind of events have the capacity to shift agendas, and that's what happened. So this was 1859 when that boat sunk, the Royal Charter. The next year, the British started issuing storm warnings from London to the ports, and then the next year they extended that into full-blown weather forecasts for 2 days to come.
Who are the key figures in this process of understanding the predictability or the patterns of weather?
Well, I've got quite a large cast of characters in my book, but the one that really reigns over them all is a man called Robert Fitzroy, who people will be familiar with Fitzroy as most likely be familiar with him as the captain of the Beagle during Darwin's famous circumnavigation in the 1830s, and we remember Fitzroy very much for this, and I think to the point whereby his association with Darwin then has obscured some of his later scientific work. But he is a fantastic character, Fitzroy. He's very much a man of his age, and he was very devoted to progress, and he had a sense of duty, and he was a real humanitarian. He wanted to save lives of sailors at sea, and essentially he was a sailor himself, and he'd studied the shifting weather patterns in places like Tierra del Fuego and Patagonia, where weather is in all of its variety, and he realised just how vulnerable people were, because he'd been the captain of a ship when people had been blown off in gales and such like. So he's the main figure. In the 1850s, he comes back to Britain after serving as the governor of New Zealand, actually, for a period. He forms what was then called the Meteorological Department, now exists as the Met Office today in Britain, and he then issues the first weather forecasts in 1861. And I think there's a really nice parallel between him and Darwin. So Darwin obviously is very famous for his theory of evolution, which explained the past in ways that people had never dared to do before. That happened with the publication of Origin in 1859, and then just 2 years later, you have Fitzroy explaining the future in ways that people hadn't really dared to do before, with his weather forecast. And I think it's an amazing coincidence that it comes from, well, it's not a coincidence of course at all, but this comes from this very tight friendship between two people.
How did that forecast of 1861 compare with our weather forecasts today?
Oh, goodness. Goodness me. Well, it was completely rudimentary. So today we have all these supercomputers which are capable of processing enormous amounts of data and doing millions and millions of sums a second to tell us what's going on over a tiny portion of land mass. But back then they really had, something like 20 or 30 telegraph stations which relayed in information about things like pressure and wind direction to a central hub in London where a little team of clerks essentially would calculate it and reduce it, and then it would be passed to Fitzroy, who would then analyse the data, and if he thought there was a storm or something untoward coming, he would then tell the ports, and if there wasn't a storm, he would pass on whatever he'd worked out to the newspapers anyway, and he actually invented the term forecast himself, because he wanted to have a new term which he didn't want it to be a scientific prediction, and he didn't want to use the old word of prognostication, because he thought that these were too mired in with different associations. So he wanted to use a new word, and he came up with this idea of forecast, which was a combination of scientific fact and what you could see with your own eyes and with your own experience. And he became a massive celebrity for the 4 years that he was really issuing these. People read his forecasts every day. They were a very personal brand in the newspapers. They called them Admiral Fitzroy's weather forecasts. And when they went right, everyone thought he was brilliant, and when they went wrong, everyone thought he was stupid. And he had a nickname as the Clerk of the Weather, and people used to make a great play on him arranging the elements and such like.
As a newspaper person, I'm interested in this angle of how the media covered the weather. Before his predictions began appearing in, I'm assuming, London newspapers, was there any weather in the prediction in the newspaper before that, or was it all just strictly reportage of this storm happened here?
Really, the predictive stuff would be like horoscopes of today, if you like. That's the best way to think of them. They were really issued by almanacs, and people used to love these. They were fantastically popular, but they were also quite light, and people just liked to look at them and think, oh, well, that's nice. And they had no scientific foundation. Often they were based on the movement of the planets and things like that. So that's really the prediction stuff. I mean, from the 1840s, you started having weather reports, so weather of the moment. So when you get Morse in the telegraph, for example, people can start saying this is what's happening. What would
Fitzroy's, one of his early newspaper weather predictions look like? What would it read like?
It would read something like you'd have a big meteorological table, which would be a real dense Victorian composition, you can imagine, with lots of numbers. And then beneath it, there would just be 3 lines maybe, and it would say general weather probable during the next 2 days. And it would say east, sunny, west, rainy, south, cloudy, north, stormy, something like that. We're talking in very general terms, and this is just applicable to the British Isles. So he didn't have a massive land mass to cover. I mean, there's lots of interest in them at the time. They became great novelties because no one had ever... The prognostications, as they used to be called, were really popular in the almanacs. Well, imagine how popular these were. This is printed in the pages of the Times and by a government employee, essentially.
Well, right now I'm looking at my iPhone, and it's telling me that it's 72 degrees, sunny in New York. I have this beautiful image of rays of sunshine with little reflections, and an hour-by-hour prediction of what will happen temperature-wise and precipitation-wise, humidity-wise throughout the end of the day. Would be fun to think of how he would react to that.
Yeah, I think you'd be very, very impressed by your wrap-up.
All right. Peter Moore, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
The book, again, is The Weather Experiment, The Pioneers Who Sought to See the Future by Peter Moore. John Williams joins me now to represent our listeners and readers. Hi, John.
Hey, Pamela.
So what questions did listeners of the podcast send to us this week? I think a couple came in via Twitter.
They did. One of them is from Alexander Mackey, who asks, how are special issues of the New York Times Book Review determined? Theme first and then books, or do the books available indicate a theme?
It's a very good question, and it's a hard question to answer. There are two different kinds of theme issues that we do at the book review. One is where the entire issue, sort of beginning to end, reflects a single theme, as with the art issue that we did a couple of weeks ago. And the other is what we sort of call a sub-theme, where part of the issue is related to a theme. We did that with the subcontinent last year. I guess that's perhaps the origin of the sub-theme term. And we've done it a few other times where we had a number of books that worked well together as a theme, but we didn't want to devote the entire issue to a theme. My feeling with theme issues is always there's a little bit of trepidation, because I know as a reader that when a theme issue arrives and it's a narrow theme that I'm not interested in, I'll just toss out the entire issue. I don't want to ever.
With the New Yorker style issue, because I thought, well, I'm not a very stylish person and I don't care. So
For me, it was the music issue. Not that I don't like music. And we know that you don't like fashion. But but anyway, we try to choose themes that we think will be broad enough that all of our readers can find something in there to be interested in. So with art, for example, we didn't want it to all be very inside art world kind of books, or simply all illustrated coffee table books, but also to include some art history, some pure history, a couple of fun books about art forgery and art theft.
And some novels.
And some novels in which art played a role. But to get back to your original question, it's impossible to choose a theme in the open-ended way that a magazine editor might be able to do, because we're not assigning based on our interests, but we're assigning reviews based on the books. And so if the books aren't there, we can't have a theme issue. So it's very hard, unless you have a really broad issue like art or money, to know ahead of time that there are going to be enough good books to justify that theme.
And how about with those sub-theme issues you discussed? Are those different than the overarching themes through the whole issue?
Those are different, because those always arise from the books themselves. So that's happened when we've seen a number of really good books on a subject or a theme, and it's come out of that. There was one that we did 2 years ago that we called The Dead of Summer, and it was all these dark, kind of gory, gothic, a little bit sort of fun horror stories that were all coming out in July, and it was a really good kind of summer theme to do. And that was really unplanned. I mean, that happened for us fairly last minute, where we just realized that, wow, we'd sent out all these books for review, and they all kind of worked nicely into this theme, and we didn't even have to fill it out with any additional assignments.
And that was a bit of counter-programming, because you think of summer books as sunny and beachy, and there were these zombies on the cover, and it was really dark. And
yes,
that
was one of my favorite issues.
And can listeners look forward to any more theme issues in the future?
Actually, I will reveal one other theme issue we have in the works coming in August. We have a New Orleans issue, and that arose because it will be the 10th anniversary of Katrina. As a consequence, publishers are releasing a number of books related to New Orleans and Katrina. New Orleans is such an interesting literary city. I was there this spring at the Tennessee Williams Literary Festival and was really taken by the city and its literary heritage. And so that's the origin of that issue, which will be a sub-theme and not a theme.
Oh, great. Something to look forward to later in the summer. And I just want to remind listeners that they can send us questions each week for the podcast that you will address to our Twitter feed, which is @NYTimesBooks, or to our email address, which is books@nytimes.com.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, Pamela.
Greg Cowles is here with Bestseller News. Hi, Greg.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new on the list?
Well, it's all familiar thriller kind of things on the hardcover fiction list this week.
Thriller kind of things. That sounds thrilling. What do we have?
The two new titles are Catherine Coulter's 19th FBI suspense thriller, Nemesis, new at number 5. And then up at number 3, Brad Thor, a thriller writer with a name I love to say, has his 15th Scott Harvath thriller, Code of Conduct, new at number 3.
I bet he has a pseudonym for his romance novels, though. What's on nonfiction?
There are 3 new titles on the nonfiction side of things. Down at number 13, the Pulitzer-winning author and journalist David E. Hoffman has a nonfiction spy thriller called The $1 Billion Spy. This is about a Soviet military engineer, Adolf Tolkachev, who for years slipped secrets to the CIA in Moscow. That's new at number 13. Then at number 7, the Texas senator and Republican presidential candidate Ted Cruz has kind of a memoir that's also like a campaign broadside called A Time for Truth. That's new at number 7.
You know, if every Republican candidate currently declared had a bestseller on the list, they could actually take over the entire list because we have 15 books on our
15
nonfiction.
spots and
Yes.
15 candidates.
So there we go, the challenge. All right, what else is new?
And then finally at number 4, the 39th president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, who's now 90 years old and makes frequent appearances on the nonfiction list.
He could have all 15 spots, too.
He's got a new memoir looking back on his life, both as a politician and his private life. It's called A Full Life, new at number 4.
All right. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. Our producer is Jocelyn Gonzalez, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.